At dawn, in the silent valleys of Sinaloa, villagers say the wind still carries screams. Not ghosts, but echoes of a cartel that turned paradise into a battlefield. The camera glides over charred cornfields, bullet-scarred houses, and roads where only dust and forgotten footsteps remain. The rising sun touches the jagged peaks of the Sierra Madre, revealing shadows that once hid entire armies. A narrator whispers, "Here, in these mountains, men didn't just enter the drug trade, they were born into it." Cut to an abandoned village school, windows shattered, graffiti of cartel symbols painted on cracked walls. For decades, this land has lived between two realities, one of poverty and one of unimaginable power. A place where a single cartel reshaped the fate of a nation. Slow-motion footage of masked gunmen riding in armored trucks, radios buzzing. This is the story of an empire built on tunnels, terror, and blood. A cartel that spread its roots across continents, yet ruled from the shadows of Sinaloa. A distant explosion echoes as the camera zooms out. This is the rise of the Sinaloa cartel, the ghost that haunted a generation.
The Valley That Never Slept. Birth of a Kingdom. How Sinaloa became a cartel nation. The story of Sinaloa's transformation into the heartland of Mexico's most powerful drug trafficking organization begins not with bullets and blood, but with geography, poverty, and the golden poppy fields that blanket the Sierra Madre Occidental. Long before the name Sinaloa Cartel became synonymous with international drug trafficking, this coastal Mexican state was already cultivating a relationship with illicit crops that would define its future for generations. Sinaloa's geographic position created the perfect conditions for what would become a narco-state. Nestled along Mexico's Pacific coast, with the rugged Sierra Madre Mountains creating natural fortifications inland, the region offered both accessibility to maritime routes and impenetrable hideouts in the highlands. The fertile valleys produced abundant agricultural yields, but it was the opium poppies and marijuana plants hidden in the mountain folds that would prove most profitable. The origins trace back to the early 20th century, when Chinese immigrants brought opium cultivation knowledge to Mexico. These immigrants, fleeing persecution and seeking opportunity, found in Sinaloa's remote mountain regions the perfect environment for poppy cultivation. The climate, elevation, and isolation created ideal growing conditions while keeping operations hidden from government eyes. Local farmers, struggling with poverty and limited legitimate economic opportunities, quickly recognized the financial potential of these crops. During World War II, the United States government actually encouraged opium production in Mexico to supplement medical morphine supplies when Asian sources were cut off. This legitimization, however temporary, established infrastructure and expertise that would never disappear. When the war ended and American demand shifted from medical to recreational, the networks remained intact, now serving a different market. The 1960s and 1970s witnessed the professionalization of drug trafficking in Sinaloa. What had been cottage industry operations run by independent farmers began consolidating under more sophisticated organizational structures. Pedro Avilés Pérez, often called El León de la Sierra, the Lion of the Mountains, emerged as one of the first major drug lords to modernize smuggling operations. He pioneered the use of aircraft for drug transportation, transforming the business from mule trains crossing mountain passes to sophisticated aerial operations that could move massive quantities quickly. Avilés Pérez established many of the operational principles that would define the Sinaloa cartel: vertical integration of production and distribution, corruption of government officials at multiple levels, strategic use of violence to eliminate competition while avoiding unnecessary attention, and reinvestment of profits into community infrastructure to maintain local support. His innovations created a template that his successors would refine and expand. The Guadalajara cartel, which dominated Mexican drug trafficking in the 1980s, included several Sinaloan traffickers who would later form the core of the Sinaloa cartel. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, known as El Padrino, the Godfather, created the first truly national drug trafficking organization in Mexico, bringing together independent operators under a unified command structure. His genius lay in recognizing that cooperation was more profitable than competition, that dividing territories and specializations allowed everyone to profit more while reducing violent conflicts that attracted government attention. When the Guadalajara cartel fractured following Félix Gallardo's arrest in 1989, he reportedly divided Mexico's drug trafficking territories among his lieutenants while imprisoned. This division, later called the Pax Mafiosa, assigned specific routes and territories to different groups. The Sinaloa territory went to Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, Ismael El Mayo Zambada, and the Beltrán Leiva brothers, among others. This wasn't merely a territorial division, but the birth certificate of what would become the world's most powerful drug trafficking organization. The newly formed Sinaloa cartel inherited more than territory. It inherited decades of accumulated expertise, corrupted officials, established smuggling routes, and most importantly, a business model that prioritized pragmatism over pride. Unlike some cartels that would later emerge with flashier, more violent approaches, the Sinaloan leadership understood that their business thrived in the shadows. They sought to corrupt rather than confront authorities, to operate beneath the public radar rather than above it. Sinaloa's culture itself became inseparable from the narco economy. In rural communities throughout the state, drug trafficking offered the only realistic path out of grinding poverty. The narcos became folk heroes, celebrated in corridos, ballad songs that romanticized their exploits and generosity. They built churches, paved roads, provided medical care, and offered employment in regions where the government provided nothing. This social investment created a protective ecosystem where local populations had strong incentives to shelter and support the cartel. The Mexican government's relationship with Sinaloan traffickers was complex and contradictory. Periodic crackdowns and arrests suggested active law enforcement, but the persistence and growth of trafficking operations revealed deeper accommodations. Many scholars argue that an implicit arrangement existed. Traffickers could operate as long as they maintained order, avoided high-profile violence, and channeled profits into the legitimate economy. This arrangement benefited corrupt officials at every level, from local police receiving modest bribes to federal officials receiving percentages of massive shipments. By the 1990s, Sinaloa had effectively become a cartel nation, with the drug economy permeating every aspect of society. Luxury vehicles filled streets in towns with no apparent legitimate economy to support such wealth. Mansions appeared in remote mountain communities. Local businesses, from car dealerships to restaurants to construction companies, thrived on narco money laundering. The state's official economy became inextricably linked with its shadow economy. The sophistication of the Sinaloa organization distinguished it from competitors. While other cartels might control territory through pure intimidation, Sinaloa invested in relationships. They paid better wages than competitors, treated their workers with more respect, and avoided the senseless violence that plagued other organizations. This created loyalty that couldn't be bought with fear alone. Former members rarely cooperated with authorities, understanding that betrayal would result not just in their own death, but harm to their entire families. Educational institutions in Sinaloa, often unknowingly, contributed to cartel operations. Graduates with degrees in chemistry, accounting, logistics, and engineering found lucrative employment with trafficking organizations. The cartel operated like a multinational corporation, with specialized departments handling production, transportation, security, finance, and human resources. This professionalization allowed it to scale operations beyond anything previous generations of traffickers had imagined. The transformation of Sinaloa into a cartel nation required systemic corruption that extended far beyond simple bribery. The organization penetrated police forces, military units, intelligence services, and political offices at municipal, state, and federal levels. They cultivated relationships over years, identifying ambitious officials early in their careers and supporting their advancement, creating debts of gratitude that would be called upon later. Some officials actively sought cartel relationships, recognizing that cooperation was more profitable than opposition. International connections solidified Sinaloa's position. Colombian cocaine producers found the Sinaloan traffickers to be reliable partners who paid on time, moved product efficiently, and maintained security. Unlike some Mexican organizations that cheated their Colombian suppliers or allowed product to be seized through carelessness, Sinaloa operated with business professionalism that built trust and secured preferential arrangements. This trust meant better prices, larger shipments, and front-loading of product that allowed Sinaloa to operate with Colombian cocaine before paying for it, a massive financial advantage.
The North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, implemented in 1994, inadvertently became a boon for Sinaloan trafficking operations. The dramatic increase in legitimate cross-border truck traffic made it exponentially more difficult for customs officials to inspect every vehicle. Sinaloa established relationships with Mexican trucking companies and created their own transportation firms, allowing them to move drugs hidden among legitimate cargo. The same trade agreement that was supposed to economically integrate North America and reduce Mexican poverty also created highways of opportunity for drug smuggling. Sinaloa's geographic advantages extended beyond mere location. The state's lengthy Pacific coastline offered numerous points for maritime smuggling and receiving shipments from South American suppliers. The rugged Sierra Madre provided not just hiding places, but a natural defensive network where cartel security could spot government forces long before they arrived. The semi-arid climate and seasonal rain patterns meant that aircraft could operate year-round from clandestine airstrips in the mountains, landing and taking off on routes that avoided radar detection. The social contract between the cartel and Sinaloan communities rested on mutual dependence. Rural families provided labor, shelter, and silence. In return, they received economic opportunities unavailable through any legitimate means. Young men could earn in one season as cartel workers what would take years to accumulate through farming or manual labor. Families could build concrete homes with running water instead of living in shacks. Children could stay in school instead of working in fields. This wasn't altruism, it was an investment in a social infrastructure that protected cartel operations. Religious institutions in Sinaloa faced difficult choices. Many Catholic churches received generous donations from traffickers, creating ethical dilemmas for priests who opposed drug trafficking but depended on narco money for their parishes. Some religious leaders openly ministered to cartel members while condemning violence. Others blessed shipments and provided religious justification for the narco lifestyle. The famous Jesus Malverde shrine in Culiacan, venerated as the patron saint of drug traffickers, became a pilgrimage site where narcos prayed for successful operations and gave thanks for deliveries completed without interception. Media in Sinaloa operated under invisible but understood constraints. Journalists quickly learned that certain topics invited deadly consequences. Investigative reporting on cartel operations, leadership, or corrupt official relationships resulted in threats, violence, or death. Many reporters practiced self-censorship, while others were directly paid by the cartel to publish favorable stories or ignore unfavorable ones. This media control ensured that Sinaloan traffickers operated with minimal public scrutiny, their activities known but rarely documented.
The transformation of Sinaloa into a cartel nation represented not simply the rise of a criminal organization, but the fundamental restructuring of an entire regional society around illicit commerce. Every institution, governmental, economic, social, religious, educational, became either compromised by or accommodated to the realities of drug trafficking. This wasn't an occupation by external forces, but an organic evolution driven by economic necessity, government failure, and the sophisticated vision of criminal entrepreneurs who recognized and exploited every opportunity.
El Chapo's ascent, the making of a narco king. Joaquin Archibaldo Guzman Loera, known to the world as El Chapo, Shorty, referring to his 5'6" stature, rose from absolute poverty in the Sinaloan mountains to become perhaps the most famous drug trafficker in history. A figure whose legend combined the ruthless brutality of a crime lord with the folk hero mythology of a Robin Hood figure, at least in the narco ballads that celebrated his exploits. Born on April 4, 1957 in La Tuna, Badiraguato, Sinaloa, Guzman entered a world of grinding poverty where legitimate opportunities were virtually non-existent. His father, Emilio Guzman Bustillos, was a cattle rancher and opium poppy farmer, and young Joaquim grew up understanding that the mountain poppy fields represented survival for families like his. The Sierra Madre communities existed in a parallel economy where opium paste and marijuana were cash crops that connected remote villages to international markets. Guzman's childhood was marked by violence and hardship. His father was reportedly abusive, beating his children and leaving deep psychological scars that some analysts suggest contributed to Guzman's later ruthlessness. Young Joaquin received little formal education, dropping out of school around 3rd grade to work in his father's fields. The illiteracy that would follow him throughout his life began here, yet it never prevented him from developing an extraordinary aptitude for the mathematics of drug trafficking, calculating loads, profits, and bribes with precision that belied his lack of formal schooling. His entry into serious drug trafficking began in his teenage years, when he started working for Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo and the Guadalajara Cartel. Guzman proved himself as a reliable operator who could move product efficiently and solve logistical problems creatively. Unlike some young traffickers who sought flashy displays of wealth and power, Guzman focused on operational excellence. He studied every aspect of the business, from cultivation to transportation to distribution, understanding that knowledge was power in this industry. By his 20s, Guzman was coordinating major smuggling operations, pioneering innovations that would become standard practice. He recognized that the traditional smuggling methods, backpackers carrying loads across mountains, small boats making coastal runs, vehicles with hidden compartments, were inefficient and limited scalability. Guzman thought bigger, employing large aircraft for major shipments, establishing sophisticated tunnel systems under border crossings, and creating elaborate front companies that moved drugs hidden in legitimate cargo. His nickname El Chapo referred to his short stature, but there was nothing small about his ambitions or capabilities. Associates noted his intense work ethic, his willingness to personally supervise operations rather than simply issuing orders from a distance, and his ability to identify talent and delegate responsibility. He built a loyal organization by treating his workers better than competitors did, paying on time, providing for families of fallen members, and showing personal interest in his subordinates' lives. When the Guadalajara cartel fractured in the late 1980s, Guzman was positioned perfectly to claim a major role in the emerging Sinaloa organization. He partnered with Ismael El Mayo Zambada and Hector El Güero Palma, forming a leadership triumvirate that would prove extraordinarily effective. While all three were capable traffickers, Guzman distinguished himself through his vision of expansion and his willingness to take calculated risks that others avoided.
The early 1990s saw Guzman establishing himself as first among equals within the Sinaloa leadership. He pioneered relationships with Colombian cocaine producers, personally traveling to Colombia to negotiate deals and establish trust. These relationships gave Sinaloa preferential access to cocaine supplies, allowing them to undercut competitors on price while maintaining quality. Guzman understood that in the drug business, as in any business, reliable supply chains and efficient operations create competitive advantages that translate directly to market dominance. His first major arrest came in Guatemala in June 1993, where he had fled after a shootout at the Guadalajara airport that killed Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo. Whether the cardinal's death was a case of mistaken identity during a cartel conflict or a deliberate attack remains disputed. But the high-profile killing brought unprecedented pressure on Mexican traffickers. Guzman's capture was celebrated as a major victory in the drug war, but it proved temporary. Imprisonment in the Puente Grande maximum security prison in Jalisco did nothing to diminish Guzman's power or operations. He continued running the Sinaloa cartel from inside, communicating orders through corrupted guards and visiting associates. His cell became an office, complete with amenities that made it more penthouse than prison. Guards delivered restaurant meals, allowed conjugal visits, and ensured that Guzman lacked for nothing. The corruption was so complete that he essentially operated freely while maintaining the fiction of incarceration. His legendary 2001 escape from Puente Grande marked a turning point in his mythology. Official accounts claimed he hid in a laundry cart that was wheeled out of the prison, but the reality was certainly more complex, involving dozens of corrupted officials at multiple levels who were paid handsomely to look the other way. The escape wasn't a dramatic movie-style breakout, but a carefully orchestrated operation funded by millions in bribes. What made it significant wasn't the method, but what it revealed. El Chapo commanded resources and loyalty that could compromise Mexico's most secure prison. Following his escape, Guzman didn't flee Mexico or seek a low profile. Instead, he consolidated power and expanded operations with renewed aggression. The early 2000s witnessed the Sinaloa cartel's transformation into a truly transnational criminal enterprise, with operations spanning continents. Guzman established distribution networks not just in the United States, but in Europe, Asia, and Australia, recognizing that diversifying markets reduced vulnerability to enforcement actions in any single country. His leadership style combined brutality with pragmatism. He ordered killings without hesitation when he perceived betrayal or threat, but he avoided the senseless violence that characterized some rival cartels. Guzman understood that excessive violence attracted government attention and was bad for business. He preferred corrupting officials to confronting them, paying off rather than killing police officers, investing in relationships that would yield long-term benefits rather than short-term intimidation. The Sinaloa cartel under Guzman's leadership became famous for its tunnels, sophisticated underground passages that crossed the U.S.-Mexico border, allowing massive drug shipments to pass completely undetected beneath border security. These weren't crude holes, but engineered structures with ventilation systems, lighting, rail systems for moving product, and reinforced walls. Some extended over a mile, connecting warehouses on both sides of the border. The investment required was enormous, but the return justified the cost. A single tunnel could move billions of dollars worth of drugs before detection. Guzman's business acumen extended to understanding vertical integration and supply chain management in ways that would impress MBA students at legitimate corporations. He controlled production in the Sierra Madre, transportation through his routes, distribution networks in major markets, and even retail operations in some areas. This integration meant profits at every stage, reducing the cartel's dependence on outside organizations that might prove unreliable or treacherous. His personal life reflected the contradictions of narco culture. He married multiple women, fathering numerous children who enjoyed lives of luxury even while their father lived as a fugitive. He built lavish estates in the Sinaloan mountains, complete with private zoos, artificial lakes, and every amenity. Yet he often retreated to simple mountain ranches where he could live like the campesino he once was. This connection to his origin was genuine, not affectation. Guzman never forgot where he came from, and it shaped his identity even as his wealth reached billions. The fortune he accumulated was almost incomprehensible. Forbes magazine included him on their billionaire list, estimating his wealth at over $1 billion, though this was certainly a conservative estimate. The Sinaloa cartel moved hundreds of tons of cocaine annually, generating revenue in the tens of billions.
Guzman's personal take was a fraction of the total, but that fraction still represented generational wealth beyond the imagination of most people. His relationship with Mexican authorities was complex. Periodic enforcement actions suggested he was actively hunted, yet his ability to operate freely in Sinaloa, attending parties, running businesses, and living openly suggested accommodations at some level. Some analysts argued that Mexican officials preferred Guzman's professional approach to the chaos that might follow if he were removed, creating an implicit understanding that allowed him freedom in exchange for maintaining relative order. The 2000s saw increasing violence as the Sinaloa cartel fought wars on multiple fronts, against the Arellano Felix organization in Tijuana, against Los Zetas and the Gulf Cartel in northeastern Mexico, and against the Juarez cartel for control of that crucial border city. Guzman prosecuted these wars with strategic brilliance, isolating enemies politically before attacking militarily, using government forces as unwitting allies by feeding intelligence about rivals to authorities, and waiting for opponents to weaken themselves before delivering crushing blows. The Juarez War proved particularly bloody. Guzman's attempt to seize control of the Juarez Plaza from the Carrillo Fuentes organization transformed that border city into a war zone. Thousands died in the conflict, which lasted years and drew in federal forces who were often manipulated by both sides. Guzman demonstrated his willingness to accept substantial casualties and collateral damage when strategic objectives required it, though he always framed the violence as necessary for business, not personal vendetta. His 2014 capture in Mazatlan came after years of manhunting by Mexican and American authorities. The operation that finally located him used electronic surveillance to track communications from his network, narrowing his location gradually until authorities could move with confidence. His capture was celebrated internationally as a major victory in the drug war, with authorities claiming it would cripple the Sinaloa cartel. The reality proved different. The organization continued operating without significant disruption, suggesting that Guzman had prepared for this possibility. Imprisoned again, this time in Altiplano maximum security prison, El Chapo once again proved that walls meant little when you commanded resources and loyalty. His 2015 escape through a sophisticated tunnel dug directly to his cell was an engineering marvel and security catastrophe. The tunnel extended over a mile, including lighting, ventilation, and a motorcycle on rails for transporting dirt out and supplies in. The precision required to dig from an exterior location to emerge precisely in Guzman's cell suggested inside information about the prison's layout and his exact location, another indication of corrupted officials. The escape was Guzman's greatest triumph, an ultimate mistake. It humiliated the Mexican government on the world stage, creating political pressure that made his recapture a national priority. President Enrique Peña Nieto's administration couldn't afford another escape, and when Guzman was captured again in January 2016 in Los Mochis, Sinaloa, the decision was made to extradite him to the United States, where extradite would be impossible. His trial in New York in 2018-2019 pulled back the curtain on Sinaloa cartel operations, with former associates providing detailed testimony about drug quantities, corruption payments, and violence. Witnesses described a criminal empire of stunning scope, cocaine shipments measured in tons, corruption payments totaling hundreds of millions, murders numbering in the thousands. Guzman was portrayed as a ruthless killer who ordered deaths casually, a womanizer who married young women then discarded them, and a paranoid leader who trusted no one completely. The prosecution presented evidence of his direct involvement in numerous murders, including ordering killings and personally participating in some executions. They documented his communication methods, his financial operations, and his organizational structure. Former close associates granted immunity or reduced sentences testified about his leadership style, his strategic thinking, and his willingness to use extreme violence to protect his empire and punish betrayal. His conviction on all counts in February 2019 was inevitable given the evidence and testimony. The sentence, life imprisonment plus 30 years, with forfeiture of $12.6 billion, was purely symbolic since he was already 61 years old and would die in prison. He was sent to ADX Florence in Colorado, America's most secure federal prison, where he remains in solitary confinement under conditions specifically designed to prevent communication with the outside world. El Chapo's legacy is contradictory and contested. To American and Mexican authorities, he represents everything wrong with the drug trade: violence, corruption, and the destruction that addiction brings to communities. To some in Sinaloa, he remains a folk hero who rose from poverty to challenge governments, who provided employment and built infrastructure where the state failed, who demonstrated that a poor mountain boy could become a billionaire through intelligence and courage. The making of El Chapo as the narco king wasn't simply about his criminal genius or ruthlessness. It was about the ecosystem that enabled his rise, the poverty that made drug trafficking the only viable economic path, the corruption that allowed operations to flourish, the demand from American consumers that created the market, and the government failures that left entire regions of Mexico without legitimate opportunity. Guzman exploited these conditions brilliantly, but he didn't create them.
The Mountain Fortress: Secrets of the Sierra Madre. The Sierra Madre Occidental mountain range stands as the natural fortress that has protected Sinaloan drug traffickers for generations. A rugged landscape of peaks, valleys, and canyons that has frustrated government forces since the beginning of the drug war. Understanding the Sinaloa cartel's resilience requires understanding this terrain, which is not merely a geographic feature, but a strategic asset that has proven nearly impossible for authorities to overcome. The Sierra Madre extends roughly 1,250 kilometers along western Mexico, with elevations reaching over 10,000 feet. The Sinaloan portion encompasses some of the most remote and rugged territory, creating what amounts to a natural defensive network where cartel operatives have every advantage. The mountains aren't simply hiding places. They're the foundation of the entire trafficking infrastructure, containing poppy fields, marijuana plantations, processing laboratories, airstrips, training camps, and communications installations. The topography creates surveillance difficulties that modern technology has only partially overcome. Deep canyons and dense vegetation make aerial observation challenging, while the limited road network forces government forces into predictable routes where cartel lookouts can spot them hours before arrival. The mountains have their own culture and logic, understood by locals but alien to outsiders, giving indigenous residents enormous advantages in navigating the terrain. Village communities scattered throughout the Sierra Madre have depended on drug cultivation for generations. These aren't recent criminal enterprises, but multi-generational operations where grandfathers, fathers, and sons have all worked in poppy fields. The communities possess intimate knowledge of the land, hidden trails, water sources, caves suitable for storage, locations where aircraft can land, information accumulated over decades and passed down through families. The cartel's defensive infrastructure in the mountains is sophisticated beyond what casual observers imagine. Networks of lookouts equipped with radios and satellite phones monitor every approach route, reporting any suspicious activity immediately to regional commanders.
Some lookouts occupy positions for weeks at a time, living in concealed camps that blend completely into the landscape. These networks create a security perimeter extending dozens of kilometers from important facilities, ensuring that approaching threats are detected with enough warning to evacuate or prepare defenses. Communications infrastructure in the Sierra Madre represents significant investment. The cartel established radio relay stations throughout the mountains, creating networks independent of commercial telecommunications. Solar panels and generators power equipment that allows instant communication across vast distances. Encrypted digital systems resist interception, while lower-tech methods ensure communication even if sophisticated equipment fails. This redundancy means the organization can coordinate operations across hundreds of square kilometers of difficult terrain. The agricultural operations in the Sierra Madre are industrial in scale despite the rustic setting. Poppy fields cover thousands of hectares, often disguised among legitimate crops or planted in locations so remote that detection is unlikely. The growing season follows traditional patterns, with planting after rainy season begins and harvest when poppy pods reach maturity. Workers score the pods to release opium latex, which is collected and processed into opium paste or black tar heroin in local laboratories. These mountain laboratories range from crude operations producing low-quality product to sophisticated facilities manufacturing high-purity heroin and synthetic drugs. The more advanced laboratories employ trained chemists, use quality equipment, and maintain strict quality control, producing product competitive with any in the world. The laboratories' locations deep in the mountains ensure that even if their existence is known, reaching them requires operations that are prohibitively difficult and dangerous for authorities. Marana cultivation follows similar patterns, with massive plantations hidden in remote valleys.
The cartel shifted increasingly to indoor cultivation in urban areas where quality could be better controlled, but mountain operations continued producing large quantities of lower-grade marijuana for mass markets. The advantage of mountain cultivation is scalability. Single plantations can encompass hundreds of acres, producing yields measured in tons rather than pounds. The introduction of synthetic drug production, particularly methamphetamine, transformed the Sierra Madre operations. Meth production requires chemical precursors, often imported from China or other Asian countries, but the actual manufacturing could occur anywhere with basic laboratory equipment. The mountains offered ideal locations for meth labs because the remote locations meant that characteristic chemical odors wouldn't attract attention, and contamination from toxic waste affected only unpopulated areas. Airstrips throughout the Sierra Madre facilitate the trafficking operation, ranging from sophisticated strips capable of handling large aircraft to crude clearings where only small planes can land. These airstrips connect the mountains to the outside world, receiving shipments of precursor chemicals, transporting finished drugs to distribution points, and moving personnel and money. The strips are often concealed, appearing as normal fields or clearings to aerial observation, with approach markers and lighting systems deployed only when aircraft are expected. The weaponry available to cartel forces in the mountains rivals that of legitimate military units. Arsenals seized in raids have revealed heavy machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, anti-aircraft weapons, and sophisticated communications equipment. Some mountain strongholds possess sufficient firepower to resist battalion-level attacks, requiring extensive operations to overcome. The weapons enter Mexico through various routes, purchased from corrupt military officials, smuggled from Central America, or acquired through American gun shops using straw purchasers. Training camps in the Sierra Madre prepare new cartel recruits for various roles. The most intensive programs train armed security forces, combining weapons handling, tactical movement, communications, and survival skills. Some instructors are former military personnel, including veterans of Mexican Special Forces units and even foreign fighters with experience in other conflicts. The training creates a militarized force capable of complex operations, not simply armed criminals firing weapons randomly.
The logistics of sustaining mountain operations are formidable. Food, supplies, fuel, chemicals, weapons, and money must be transported into remote locations where normal commercial infrastructure doesn't exist. The cartel operates supply chains that would challenge legitimate organizations, coordinating movements of supplies with operational security that prevents detection. Many supplies enter through normal channels, purchased from unsuspecting businesses, then diverted to mountain destinations. Residential compounds for cartel leadership dot the Sierra Madre, often built in locations chosen for defensibility rather than comfort. These compounds feature multiple security layers, perimeter observation posts, defensive fighting positions, escape routes through difficult terrain, and sometimes underground bunkers for last-ditch protection. The compounds house not just the leaders, but their families and close associates, creating fortified villages where cartel figures can live in relative security, despite being wanted by authorities. The relationship between cartel forces and Mexican military units in the mountains is complex. Some operations involve genuine combat, with military forces attacking cartel positions and meeting armed resistance. Other encounters are theater, with both sides firing weapons without serious attempts to inflict casualties, maintaining the appearance of enforcement without actually threatening cartel operations. The difference often depends on whether the particular military commanders are on cartel payroll or are genuine threats. Government operations in the Sierra Madre face enormous challenges beyond just the terrain. Intelligence is compromised by cartel penetration of security forces and local populations loyal to traffickers. Operations are detected far in advance, allowing targets to escape before troops arrive.
When confrontations occur, cartel forces often have advantages of position, local knowledge, and motivation that regular soldiers lack. Soldiers are rotated frequently and don't know the terrain. Cartel fighters live there and understand every detail. The Mexican military has attempted various strategies to overcome these disadvantages. Helicopter-borne assault operations bypass the limited road network, inserting forces directly into target areas. These operations have scored some successes, capturing cartel figures and destroying facilities. But they're expensive, dangerous, and often result in targets simply relocating after troops withdraw. The mountains are too vast and the cartel too dispersed for occupation to be practical. Technological advantages that government forces should possess often prove less effective than expected in mountain operations. Sophisticated surveillance systems, drones, and satellite imagery can locate facilities, but translating that information into successful operations remains difficult. The time required to organize and execute operations based on intelligence often exceeds the warning time that cartel lookouts provide, allowing targets to vanish before arrival. The civilian population in the Sierra Madre exists in a difficult position, caught between cartel forces and government troops, both of which make demands and threats. Many residents depend economically on drug cultivation and cartel employment, giving them strong incentives to support traffickers over authorities. Government forces are often viewed as outsiders who bring violence and destruction without improving lives, while cartel operatives are neighbors, family, and employers who provide the only economic opportunities available. The environmental damage from drug cultivation and processing in the Sierra Madre is significant but rarely discussed. Poppy and marijuana cultivation involves deforestation and intensive pesticide use. Methamphetamine production generates toxic waste that is dumped indiscriminately, contaminating soil and water. The chemicals used in cocaine processing that occurs in some mountain laboratories introduce additional pollutants. The long-term environmental consequences won't be fully understood for generations. The seasonal rhythms of the Sierra Madre create variations in cartel activities and government enforcement possibilities. The rainy season brings road closures and limits mobility, reducing government operations but also complicating supply for cartel operations. Harvest seasons see increased activity as crops are collected and transported. Weather patterns affect aircraft operations, communications, and basic logistics for both sides in the ongoing conflict.
The mythology surrounding the Sierra Madre in narco culture runs deep. Corridos celebrate the mountains as symbols of freedom, where cartel fighters successfully defy governments and maintain their independence. The mountains represent both physical refuge and cultural identity, places where sin-alone traffickers emerged and to which they return when threatened. This mythology reinforces the psychological importance of the mountains beyond their practical military value. Future technological developments may eventually overcome the advantages that terrain provides to traffickers, but such breakthroughs haven't occurred despite decades of efforts. Each new surveillance technology, tactical innovation, or intelligence technique is eventually understood and countered by cartel forces who adapt their operations. The fundamental reality remains that the Sierra Madre Occidental is a fortress that has protected sin-alone traffickers for generations and continues doing so despite enormous resources deployed against them.
Tunnels of Terror. Engineering the Invisible Empire. The tunnel systems operated by the Sinaloa cartel represent one of the most sophisticated aspects of their smuggling operations, underground passages that allow massive quantities of drugs to cross international borders completely unseen, bypassing walls, fences, sensors, and armed patrols. These tunnels are not crude holes dug by amateurs, but engineered structures that demonstrate significant technical expertise, enormous financial investment, and long-term strategic planning. The history of drug smuggling tunnels dates to the 1980s, when early traffickers dug simple passages under the U.S.-Mexico border. These primitive tunnels were often cramped, poorly ventilated, and structurally unsound, sometimes collapsing and killing workers or smugglers. They were crude but effective, moving product that wouldn't otherwise cross the border. The early success demonstrated that underground smuggling was viable, inspiring investment in more sophisticated operations. The evolution to the super tunnels of the 2000s and 2010s represented a quantum leap in engineering and ambition. These weren't simple burrows, but underground highways featuring reinforced walls, ventilation systems, lighting, drainage, rail systems for moving product, and even air conditioning in some cases. The longest discovered tunnel extended over 4,000 feet from Tijuana to San Diego, crossing the border at depths of 70 feet below ground, well beneath any border barrier or sensor system. The engineering challenges of constructing such tunnels are substantial. Builders must navigate varying soil conditions, underground water tables, bedrock formations, and existing infrastructure like utility lines and building foundations. The tunnels must maintain structural integrity under the weight of earth and buildings above, while providing safe working conditions for diggers and eventual smuggling operations. Sophisticated tunnels include support timbers or concrete reinforcement, preventing collapses that would be catastrophic for the investment and the people inside. The construction process requires specialized expertise, and the Sinaloa cartel recruited experienced mining engineers and tunneling specialists to design and supervise construction. Some engineers were hired unknowingly, given cover stories about legitimate construction projects. Others knew exactly what they were building and were compensated handsomely for their participation and silence. The expertise required meant that tunnel construction wasn't something that could be improvised. It required genuine professional competence. Ventilation systems in sophisticated tunnels addressed one of the critical challenges of underground work. Without air circulation, carbon dioxide accumulates to dangerous levels, oxygen depletes, and workers suffocate. The ventilation systems in advanced tunnels used PVC pipes extending to the surface, sometimes incorporating powered fans to force air circulation. These systems allowed workers to labor in the tunnels for extended periods and ensured that smugglers could transit the passage without risking asphyxiation. Lighting systems varied from basic battery-powered fixtures to sophisticated installations with generators providing continuous power. Work lights allowed construction crews to dig efficiently, while operational lighting enabled smugglers to navigate and move product quickly during smuggling runs.
Some tunnels included communication systems allowing personnel at both ends to coordinate operations, though these systems risked electronic detection if not properly shielded. The rail systems installed in many advanced tunnels demonstrated the scale of ambition. These weren't toy trains, but functional systems capable of moving hundreds of pounds of cargo on wheeled carts that ran on tracks, often powered by winches or simple propulsion. The rail systems dramatically increased efficiency, allowing a small crew to move loads that would require dozens of people to carry and reducing transit time through the tunnel from hours to minutes. Water management presented ongoing challenges. Underground water tables meant that many tunnels encountered seepage or flooding, requiring drainage systems and pumps to keep passages clear. Some tunnel builders incorporated specialized drainage designs that channeled water away from the tunnel or into sumps where it could be pumped to the surface.
Failure to manage water could render a tunnel unusable, representing a complete loss of the enormous investment required for construction. The endpoints of tunnels were typically located in buildings that the cartel controlled, warehouses, commercial properties, or residential structures. On the Mexican side, these buildings provided cover for construction activities, with dirt excavated from the tunnel removed under guise of legitimate construction or simply trucked away at night. On the American side, the cartel either purchased properties or established front businesses that explained the presence of workers and vehicles. The most sophisticated tunnels included entrance points hidden beneath hydraulic lift platforms or inside closets with concealed doors. These entrances could be sealed quickly if law enforcement approached, making detection difficult even if agents entered the building. Some tunnels had multiple access points, allowing emergency exits if one entrance was compromised. The depth of tunnels varied based on engineering requirements and tactical considerations. Deeper tunnels were harder to detect with ground-penetrating radar and other sensor systems, but they required more excavation and longer construction times. Shallow tunnels were faster to build, but more vulnerable to detection and collapse. Most sophisticated tunnels operated at depths between 40 and 80 feet, balancing security needs with construction practicality. The construction timeline for a major tunnel could extend from several months to over a year, depending on length, depth, soil conditions, and sophistication of features. The work occurred in shifts around the clock, with crews rotating to maintain continuous progress. The longer the construction period, the greater the risk of detection, creating pressure to complete work quickly while maintaining structural integrity and operational security. Security during construction was paramount. The cartel needed to prevent detection by authorities, but also had to protect against theft or betrayal by workers who might attempt to extort money or sell information. Workers were typically recruited from trusted networks, often from rural areas where loyalty could be ensured through family connections. They were paid well, but also understood that betrayal would result in death for themselves and potentially their families. The discovery process for tunnels varied. Some were found through intelligence operations that identified suspicious activity at possible tunnel endpoints. Others were located through sensor systems that detected underground anomalies or through confidential informants who provided information. Some tunnels were only discovered after months or years of operation when accumulated evidence finally pointed authorities to their existence. The operational lifespan of tunnels ranged from single uses to continuous operations spanning years. Some tunnels were discovered during or shortly after first use, representing complete financial losses for the enormous construction investment. Others operated successfully for extended periods, moving tons of drugs and generating billions in revenue before discovery. The uncertainty of operational lifespan required calculating whether the investment was worthwhile against the risk of early detection. The quantities of drugs moved through tunnels before discovery were staggering. Some tunnels moved dozens of tons of cocaine, marijuana, and heroin before authorities interdicted them. The profitability justified the investment. A single successful tunnel could generate hundreds of millions or billions in revenue, making even the loss of occasionally discovered tunnels acceptable from a business perspective. Counter-tunnel operations evolved as the scale of the tunnel threat became apparent.
U.S. authorities deployed ground-penetrating radar systems, seismic sensors, and other detection technologies designed to identify underground anomalies. Mexican and American agencies created specialized tunnel task forces combining engineering expertise, intelligence analysis, and operational capabilities. Bilateral cooperation improved, with information sharing becoming more routine. The tunnel problem extended beyond the U.S.-Mexico border. Sinaloa cartel operations in various countries included tunnels for different purposes: hiding places for leadership, emergency exit routes, access to underground processing laboratories.
The engineering principles remained consistent even if the specific applications varied. The expertise developed for border tunnels transferred to these other applications, making the cartel's investment in tunneling capabilities valuable beyond just cross-border smuggling. Legal consequences for tunnel operations were severe when offenders were captured. U.S. law enforcement treated tunnel operations as among the most serious trafficking offenses, warranting maximum sentences. The tunnels demonstrated premeditation, sophisticated criminal enterprise, and ongoing trafficking operations rather than individual smuggling attempts. Prosecutions emphasized the organizational nature of tunnel operations, seeking to dismantle networks rather than simply charging individuals. The financial loss when a tunnel was discovered was substantial but not catastrophic to the cartel's overall operations. The construction costs reportedly ranged from hundreds of thousands to several $1,000,000 depending on sophistication and length. While significant, these costs represented acceptable business risks given the enormous profits from successful operations. The cartel operated multiple tunnels simultaneously, ensuring that the loss of one didn't cripple overall smuggling capacity. The symbolic importance of tunnels extended beyond their practical smuggling value. They demonstrated the cartel's sophistication, resources, and willingness to invest in long-term infrastructure rather than relying solely on short-term opportunistic smuggling methods. The tunnels projected power and competence, reinforcing the cartel's reputation as the premier trafficking organization. When El Chapo escaped through a tunnel from Mexico's highest security prison, it became legend, proof that his organization could overcome any barrier. The future of tunnel smuggling remains contested. Enhanced detection technology may eventually make tunnels impractical or at least more expensive to operate successfully. Alternatively, cartels may develop even more sophisticated concealment methods and countermeasures against detection systems. The ongoing arms race between smugglers and law enforcement continues, with tunnels representing one theater in the larger conflict over border security and drug trafficking. The drug highway, from desert trails to global markets. The transportation networks that move Sinaloa cartel drugs from production sites to consumers span continents and utilize every conceivable smuggling method, creating a global supply chain of illicit substances that rivals legitimate international businesses in scope and sophistication. Understanding these routes reveals an organization that thinks strategically about logistics, risk management, and market diversification. The journey of Sinaloan drugs begins in the production zones, poppy fields and laboratories in the Sierra Madre, cocaine received from Colombian suppliers at Pacific ports, methamphetamine precursor chemicals arriving from Asia. These origins connect through transportation networks to distribution points in major cities throughout Mexico, the United States, and increasingly worldwide markets in Europe, Asia, and Australia. The primary destination for Sinaloan drugs has always been the United States, the world's largest drug consumer market. American demand for cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and marijuana created the economic engine driving the entire trafficking enterprise. The proximity of the U.S.-Mexico border created opportunities that Sinaloan traffickers exploited with consistent innovation, developing smuggling methods that evolved continuously to overcome enforcement measures. Land routes across the U.S.-Mexico border employed every conceivable method. Vehicle concealment techniques ranged from simple hidden compartments to sophisticated fabrication that integrated drugs into the vehicle structure itself, making detection extremely difficult without complete disassembly. Gas tanks, door panels, seats, engine compartments, tires, and vehicle frames all served as concealment spaces in different operations. Commercial truck traffic represented the highest volume smuggling method, particularly after NAFTA dramatically increased cross-border transportation. The sheer volume of trucks crossing daily, thousands at major ports of entry, made comprehensive inspection impossible. Even with technology like X-ray systems and drug detecting devices, authorities could only inspect small percentages of vehicles, creating opportunities that traffickers exploited systematically. The cartel established relationships with Mexican trucking companies, either corrupting employees or creating front companies that appeared to be legitimate haulers. These companies transported legitimate cargo, establishing patterns of normal operation that shielded occasional drug shipments. The cartel also utilized blind mules, unwitting drivers whose vehicles were loaded with drugs without their knowledge, protecting the organization if the shipment was intercepted. Maritime smuggling routes along Mexico's extensive Pacific and Gulf coasts provided alternatives to land border crossings. Fishing vessels, pleasure boats, cargo ships, and increasingly semi-submersible vessels and fully submersible narco-submarines moved massive quantities of cocaine from South American suppliers to Mexican reception points. The Pacific Ocean's vastness made interdiction extremely challenging despite Coast Guard and Navy patrols. Semi-submersibles represented significant innovations in maritime smuggling. These vessels, often custom-built in Colombian jungles, rode low in the water with only a small portion visible above the surface, making detection by radar or visual observation extremely difficult. They could carry multiple tons of cocaine, traveling thousands of miles from Colombia to Mexican waters. While many were intercepted, enough succeeded to make their construction and operation worthwhile. Fully submersible narco-submarines marked the next evolution, vessels capable of traveling completely underwater to avoid detection altogether. These submarines, while technologically less sophisticated than military submarines, demonstrated remarkable engineering and represented enormous investments. Their successful construction and operation revealed that trafficking organizations possessed resources and expertise rivaling some national governments. Aerial smuggling routes utilized light aircraft flying from remote airstrips in Mexico to drop zones in the United States or to intermediate locations in Central America. These flights occurred at night, flying low to avoid radar detection, landing on rural roads or clandestine airstrips.
Loads were transferred to vehicles and moved into distribution networks. The risk was substantial. Many aircraft were intercepted or crashed, but successful flights moved such valuable loads that losses were acceptable. The Caribbean route, while more associated with other trafficking organizations, also served Sinaloan operations. Drugs moved from South America through Central American countries, through Caribbean islands, and into Florida or along the Gulf Coast. This route diversified risk, ensuring that interdiction along any single corridor didn't cripple overall operations. The distribution network within the United States operated with cellular structure that protected the organization from enforcement. Individual cells handled specific functions: transportation, storage, distribution, with limited knowledge of other cells. This compartmentalization meant that arrests rarely compromised broader networks. Communication occurred through sophisticated means, including encrypted devices, coded language, and human couriers carrying messages. Major American cities served as distribution hubs where wholesale quantities were broken down for regional distribution. Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, Atlanta, and Phoenix featured prominently as hubs, but the Sinaloa cartel's reach extended to virtually every state. The cartel established relationships with street gangs and local distribution networks, supplying product at wholesale prices and allowing locals to handle retail sales, keeping the cartel's presence less visible. The logistics of moving money back to Mexico presented challenges as significant as drug smuggling itself.
Bulk cash was heavy, detectable, and vulnerable to seizure. The cartel employed multiple methods: physical smuggling, wire transfers through front businesses, trade-based money laundering using over and under invoicing, and cryptocurrency transactions. Each method had advantages and vulnerabilities, so diversification reduced overall risk. The expansion to European markets occurred as the cartels sought to diversify beyond dependence on American consumers. European prices for cocaine were substantially higher than U.S. prices, making the longer transportation distances and greater risks worthwhile. Cocaine moved from South Africa to West Africa, then to European ports or directly across the Atlantic in shipping containers or on cargo vessels. The cartel established relationships with European criminal organizations, particularly Italian mafias, Albanian networks, and British gangs, who handled distribution within European countries. These partnerships required trust building over time, with initial transactions being smaller and more cautious before expanding to major volumes. The cultural and geographic distance created challenges, but also opportunities as European demand remained strong. Asian and Australian markets represented newer frontiers for Sinaloan expansion. Methamphetamine particularly found strong demand in these markets, with Australian prices reaching levels that made long-distance smuggling extraordinarily profitable. Shipments moved through Pacific maritime routes, concealed in legitimate cargo containers, or smuggled by mule couriers traveling via commercial aviation. The coordination of global operations required sophisticated communications infrastructure. The cartel utilized encrypted messaging systems, satellite phones, and code-based communications that could appear innocent to interceptors. High-level communications often occurred through face-to-face meetings rather than electronic means, recognizing that any electronic communication risked interception regardless of encryption. The evolution of smuggling methods occurred constantly, responding to enforcement innovations. When border X-ray systems became common, the cartel invested in researching materials and configurations that would pass through undetected. When drug-detecting dogs became standard, they explored masking scents and containment methods that prevented detection. The constant adaptation characterized the organization's approach, never static, always evolving. The risks to individual smugglers and transporters were substantial. Many were caught and received lengthy prison sentences. Some died in crashes, shootouts, or ocean accidents. Others were killed by the organization itself when suspicions of cooperation with authorities arose. Despite these risks, recruitment remained easy because the financial rewards far exceeded what most people could earn in legitimate occupations. The environmental impact of drug transportation is rarely considered but significant. Aircraft crashes deposited drugs and aviation fuel in remote locations. Semi-submersibles were often scuttled after deliveries, sinking toxic materials. Vehicle emissions from smuggling operations contributed to pollution. These impacts were externalities that the cartel never accounted for in their operations.
War without mercy, the battle against rival cartels. The Sinaloa cartel's dominance was never assured or uncontested, but achieved through decades of violent conflicts against rival organizations seeking to claim territories, routes, and markets. These cartel wars transformed regions of Mexico into battlegrounds where thousands died in conflicts that continue with varying intensity to the present day. Understanding these wars reveals the brutal reality beneath the business operations, a willingness to use extreme violence to protect market position and eliminate competition. The conflict with the Tijuana cartel, led by the Arellano Felix organization, AFO, defined the 1990s and early 2000s. Tijuana's strategic importance as a border crossing to lucrative Southern California markets made it perpetually contested. The AFO controlled Tijuana for years through extreme violence and comprehensive corruption of local authorities.
The Sinaloa cartel's attempt to seize control sparked a war that killed thousands and transformed Tijuana into one of the world's most dangerous cities. The AFO earned a reputation for particular brutality, pioneering tactics that would later become commonplace among Mexican cartels. They maintained strict control through terror, killing actual and suspected opponents with creative cruelty designed to intimidate. Bodies were displayed publicly, often mutilated or with messages attached, turning murder into psychological warfare designed to demonstrate power and punish defiance. The Sinaloa strategy in Tijuana combined military pressure with political manipulation. They fed intelligence about AFO operations to Mexican and American authorities, using law enforcement as an indirect weapon against their rivals. Simultaneously, they recruited from within the AFO organization, offering better terms to persuade defections, gradually weakening their opponents from within while attacking externally. The arrest and death of several Arellano Felix brothers gradually shifted the balance. Mexican and American authorities, often acting on intelligence provided by Sinaloan sources, captured or killed AFO leadership, creating opportunities for Sinaloa to gain ground. The war never truly ended, but transitioned into a frozen conflict with Sinaloa holding significant influence while AFO remnants retained some presence. The battle for Ciudad Juarez proved even bloodier and more protracted. Juarez's importance as a border crossing made it Mexico's most valuable trafficking plaza, and the resident Juarez cartel, led by the Carrillo Fuentes family, defended their territory fiercely. When the Sinaloa cartel attempted to seize control in 2008, Juarez exploded into violence that peaked with over 3,000 murders in 2010 alone. The Juarez War demonstrated El Chapo's strategic thinking and ruthlessness. He didn't simply attack the Juarez cartel militarily, but orchestrated a comprehensive campaign combining violence, intelligence warfare, and political pressure. Sinaloa forces fed information about Juarez cartel operations to authorities, used propaganda to paint themselves as less violent than their opponents, and recruited extensively from the local population and from Juarez cartel ranks. The violence in Juarez shocked even by Mexican standards. Daily murders became routine, with bodies abandoned throughout the city. Car bombs, a rarity in Mexican cartel conflicts, appeared multiple times. Attacks on police, military, and government officials sought to intimidate authorities into neutrality or cooperation. The civilian population suffered tremendously, caught between cartel forces and increasingly militarized police responses. Mexican federal forces deployed to Juarez in supposed peacekeeping operations, but their presence complicated rather than resolved the situation. Evidence suggested that military forces were compromised, with some units effectively serving as armed wings of one cartel or another. Residents couldn't determine who represented genuine law enforcement versus which uniformed forces were actually working for traffickers. The battle against Los Zetas represented an existential conflict for the Sinaloa cartel. They eventually split from the Gulf Cartel and became independent, expanding aggressively through extreme violence that shocked even by cartel standards. Los Zetas' military origins created a different operational approach. They emphasized territorial control and diversification into other criminal activities, extortion, kidnapping, human trafficking, oil theft, beyond traditional drug trafficking. Their extreme violence was less calculated than Sinaloa's, more willing to kill civilians and generate attention that Sinaloan traffickers traditionally avoided. The Sinaloa-Zetas conflict spread across multiple states as both organizations sought to control key territories and routes. The violence was particularly intense in states like Tamaulipas, Nuevo León, and Veracruz, where Los Zetas were strongest. The cartel conflicts merged with politics and business, with both sides seeking to dominate not just drug trafficking but entire regional economies.
The Sinaloa cartel's response to Los Zetas included unusual tactics. They openly distributed propaganda, even hanging banners accusing Los Zetas of killing innocent civilians while claiming Sinaloa only targeted rival traffickers. Whether this was genuine ethical distinction or cynical public relations, it demonstrated Sinaloa's recognition that public perception mattered. They wanted to be seen as the lesser evil, professional criminals rather than indiscriminate killers. The fragmentation of the Beltran Leyva organization, BLO, from Sinaloa created internal conflicts that proved particularly bitter. The Beltran Leyva brothers had been core Sinaloa cartel leaders, but split following the 2008 arrest of Alfredo Beltran Leyva, which they blamed on betrayal by El Chapo and El Mayo. The resulting war was personal and vicious, with both sides possessing intimate knowledge of the other's operations, networks, and vulnerabilities. The conflict brought together complementary capabilities, BLO's deep trafficking expertise and connections with Zeta's military discipline and violent reputation. The war involved high-profile killings, including the 2009 torture and murder of BLO leader Arturo Beltran Leyva by Mexican Marines, an operation that intelligence suggested had Sinaloan assistance. The concept of plaza bosses created feudal structures within cartel territories, with regional commanders exercising significant autonomy while owing allegiance to central leadership. These bosses collected taxes from drug shipments through their territories, managed local operations, recruited personnel, and maintained relationships with government officials. The system allowed scalability but created vulnerability when plaza bosses defected to rival organizations or attempted independence. The recruitment of armed wings paralleled legitimate military structures. The cartel established training camps where recruits learned weapons handling, tactical movement, communications, and cartel protocols. The most dedicated might eventually join elite units like Los Anthrax or Los Acme, specialized enforcement groups that handled high-profile operations, protection of leadership, and conflicts requiring sophisticated capabilities beyond street-level enforcers. The weaponry employed in cartel wars escalated dramatically over time. Early conflicts involved pistols and occasional automatic rifles. By the 2000s, cartels possessed arsenals including heavy machine guns, grenade launchers, rocket-propelled grenades, and anti-aircraft weapons. Some weapons came from corrupt Mexican military sources, others from Central American countries, and many from the United States, where lax gun laws allowed straw purchasers to smuggle firearms south. The armored vehicles that appeared in cartel conflicts represented another escalation. Narco tanks, civilian vehicles modified with armor plating, gun ports, and battering ramps appeared in multiple conflicts, providing mobile protection during attacks. These vehicles demonstrated engineering capability and resources, though their effectiveness was limited since armor was typically jury-rigged rather than professionally designed. The psychological warfare aspect of cartel conflicts involved mutilated bodies, public displays of violence, and narco messages left with victims.
These weren't random sadism, but calculated communications designed to intimidate rivals, punish traitors, warn against defection, and demonstrate power. The messages were often addressed to specific individuals or organizations, making clear that the violence wasn't arbitrary but purposeful. The civilian casualties from cartel wars numbered in the tens of thousands, fundamentally transforming Mexican society. Many deaths were directly targeted: journalists, police, government officials, business owners who refused extortion, rival cartel members, and their families. Others were collateral damage: bystanders killed in crossfire, cases of mistaken identity, victims of kidnapping gone wrong, or people simply in the wrong place at wrong time. The psychological impact on communities trapped in conflict zones created trauma that will last generations. Children grew up seeing bodies in streets, hearing gunfire at night, living with uncertainty about whether violence would visit their families.
Trust in institutions eroded as police, military, and government proved unable or unwilling to provide security. Many residents simply fled, abandoning homes and businesses to escape the violence. The economic damage to conflict zones was substantial. Businesses closed due to extortion demands, violence, or fleeing customers. Property values collapsed in the most affected areas. Tourism disappeared from areas that previously thrived on visitors. Legitimate investment avoided regions marked by violence, leaving communities with deteriorating infrastructure and minimal economic opportunities beyond the drug economy.
The art of fear, brutality as a weapon. The violence employed by the Sinaloa cartel and its rivals transcends mere criminality to become systematic terrorism designed to control populations, eliminate opposition, and communicate power. Understanding the calculated nature of this brutality reveals organizations that view extreme violence not as unavoidable consequence, but as strategic tool wielded with specific purposes. The methods employed shock the conscience while demonstrating the depths of moral depravity that trafficking organizations reached in pursuit of dominance. The execution methods preferred by cartel enforcers were deliberately cruel, designed to inflict maximum psychological impact beyond simply ending lives. Bodies were tortured before death, bearing evidence of beatings, burnings, mutilation, and other abuse, meant to extract information, punish perceived betrayals, or simply terrorize. The torture served multiple purposes: operational intelligence gathering, enforcing discipline within the organization, and broadcasting warnings to rivals and potential defectors. Decapitation became a signature tactic, with severed heads displayed publicly or delivered to specific targets. The practice drew from historical Mexican revolutionaries and violence, but cartels systematized it as deliberate messaging. Heads were left at police stations, outside newspaper offices, in ice chests delivered to government buildings, or simply placed in public plazas. Each placement was calculated, a message to specific audiences that violence would visit anyone who opposed the cartel. The practice of dismemberment extended beyond decapitation to complete bodily destruction. Bodies were found cut into pieces, with parts distributed across cities or stuffed into barrels. The dehumanization was complete and purposeful, reducing human beings to meat, destroying dignity even in death. The message was clear: this fate awaited anyone who betrayed the organization or supported rivals. Dissolution of bodies in acid or chemical baths represented perhaps the most disturbing method. Specialized workers, sometimes called stew makers, disposed of victims by dissolving them in drums of acid or lye, eliminating physical evidence completely. The practice was both practical, no body meant no crime in strict legal terms, and terrifying, as victims simply disappeared without trace. Families never received remains for burial, denied even the closure of knowing their loved one's fate. Public displays of violence created spectacles of terror designed to traumatize entire communities. Bodies were hung from highway overpasses, positioned to be visible to mourning commuters. Corpses were arranged in public places with signs around their necks explaining alleged offenses. The displays transformed public spaces into galleries of horror, making violence unavoidable for anyone living in affected areas. Mass killings demonstrated organizational capacity and willingness to engage in wholesale slaughter. Massacres targeting rival cartel members or sometimes civilians mistaken for rivals saw dozens killed in single events. The San Fernando massacres in Tamaulipas, where Los Zetas killed 72 migrants in 2010 and later murdered 193 people whose bodies were found in mass graves, represented the extreme end of this brutality, though Sinaloa was implicated in various mass killings throughout different conflicts. The targeting of family members broke traditional criminal codes that had previously limited violence to those directly involved in trafficking. When cartels began systematically killing wives, children, and parents of rivals or defectors, they eliminated any notion of civilian immunity. This expansion of violence meant that no one connected to the trafficking world could feel safe, creating fear that extended far beyond actual combatants. Sexual violence was employed as weapon and punishment, with victims experiencing rape and sexual torture before death. Women affiliated with rival organizations or government forces were specifically targeted for sexualized violence designed to humiliate male members of those organizations. The gender-specific nature of this violence added another dimension to the terror, making clear that no one was safe regardless of their level of direct involvement. The recordings and distributions of torture and executions represented deliberate psychological warfare, amplified by digital technology.
Videos showing torture, interrogations, and executions circulated through social media, creating viral terror that reached audiences far beyond those who might witness violence directly. These videos served multiple purposes: intimidating rivals, deterring defection, claiming responsibility for specific killings, and demonstrating organizational power. The production quality of some violence videos suggested media sophistication, with editing, music, and graphics that transformed executions into propaganda products. These weren't just leaked footage, but produced content designed for specific audiences. The professionalism made them more disturbing. This wasn't spontaneous violence, but calculated messaging requiring planning, production, and distribution infrastructure. The targeting of journalists became systematic in areas of cartel conflict. Reporters investigating trafficking, corruption, or violence received warnings, sometimes verbal threats, other times mutilated bodies of colleagues. Dozens of journalists were murdered, many others disappeared. The impact was profound self-censorship throughout Mexican media, with vast areas of cartel activity becoming effectively unreportable as journalists concluded that certain stories weren't worth their lives. The murders of government officials sent messages to the political establishment. Police chiefs, mayors, prosecutors, and judges who demonstrated excessive enthusiasm for anti-cartel work were assassinated, sometimes publicly and spectacularly. The killings communicated that cooperation with government brought death, while cooperation with cartels brought protection and profit. Many officials received the message and adjusted their behavior accordingly. The phenomenon of narco-blockades demonstrated cartel ability to paralyze cities through coordinated violence. Responding to government operations or rival cartel incursions, traffickers orchestrated simultaneous attacks throughout urban areas, burning vehicles, blocking major roads, attacking police stations and government buildings, and creating chaos that overwhelmed authorities. These blockades demonstrated that cartels could seize control of cities when they chose, revealing government weakness. The specific brutality employed by different organizations created distinctive signatures. Los Zetas became infamous for particular cruelty and indiscriminate violence. The Knights Templar cartel developed quasi-religious justifications for their actions. The Jalisco New Generation cartel, CJNG, employed military-style tactics and open confrontation with authorities. The Sinaloa cartel, despite public relations suggesting they were less violent, participated fully in extreme brutality when strategic interests required. The psychological profile of individuals who could commit such acts remains debated. Some enforcers were clearly sociopathic, enjoying violence and lacking empathy. Others were reportedly normal people who compartmentalized their actions as necessary work. Drug use, particularly methamphetamine, sometimes facilitated violence by removing inhibitions and increasing aggression. Financial incentives and loyalty to organizations motivated others who might not naturally be violent. The desensitization that occurred within cartel enforcement wings created cultures where extreme violence became normalized. New recruits might initially be shocked by brutality, but gradually accepted it as routine.
Veteran enforcers spoke casually about killings and torture as mundane work tasks. This normalization allowed organizations to maintain enforcement capacity despite the psychological toll that such activities might otherwise inflict. The impact on victims' families and communities created cycles of trauma and revenge. Relatives of those killed sometimes sought vengeance, perpetuating conflicts across generations. Communities lost faith in authorities who couldn't protect them, sometimes turning to cartels for rough justice against common criminals. The social fabric degraded under sustained violence, with trust, cooperation, and community cohesion breaking down. The religious dimensions of cartel violence included both appeals to folk saints like Jesus Malverde and Santa Muerte for protection, and occasional religious justifications for violence. Some cartel members convinced themselves they were soldiers in righteous causes, protecting communities from government oppression or more violent rivals.
These justifications likely serve to rationalize actions that might otherwise produce psychological distress. The question of whether such brutality was necessary for cartel operations remains debated. Some analysts argue that extreme violence was counterproductive, attracting government attention and public outrage that more restrained operations could avoid. Others contend that in the absence of legal enforcement mechanisms, cartels needed credible deterrence against betrayal and competition, making violence economically rational, however morally repugnant.
The invisible government, corruption, power, control. The Sinaloa cartel's greatest weapon wasn't guns or tunnels, but systematic corruption that penetrated every level of Mexican government and society, creating a parallel power structure that allowed trafficking operations to continue despite formal illegality. Understanding this corruption reveals that the drug trade isn't simply a criminal enterprise operating against government, but a sophisticated political economy where official and unofficial power structures intertwine inextricably. The corruption begins at the lowest levels with municipal police officers who receive modest regular payments for ignoring trafficking activities or providing information about patrols and operations. These payments often exceed official salaries, making refusal economically difficult for officers supporting families on government wages. The corruption becomes institutionalized as commanders collect percentages from their subordinates' illicit income, creating hierarchies that mirror official organizational charts. State police forces face similar penetration, with the additional complexity that their broader jurisdiction and investigative responsibilities make them more valuable to cartels. State investigators who could detect trafficking operations or build criminal cases against cartel members are either corrupted or neutralized. Those who resist face threats to themselves and families, creating powerful incentives for cooperation beyond simple financial motivation. Federal police and security forces represent prizes for cartel corruption efforts. Officers with national jurisdiction who protect high-level shipments or provide intelligence about operations against cartel interests command substantial compensation. The revelation that Genaro Garcia Luna, Mexico's former Secretary of Public Security, who led the federal police and was responsible for anti-drug operations, was convicted in 2023 of accepting millions in bribes from the Sinaloa cartel, demonstrated that corruption reached the absolute highest levels. Military corruption proved equally pervasive despite the armed forces' reputation as less compromised than police. Soldiers received payments for ignoring trafficking activities in their patrol areas, for providing advance warning of operations, or for direct protection of drug shipments. Some military units effectively worked as armed wings of cartels, using government weapons and authority to support trafficking operations while supposedly combating them. Intelligence service penetration gave cartels access to classified information about investigations, informants, surveillance operations, and planned enforcement actions.
This intelligence allowed trafficking organizations to operate with nearly perfect information about government actions against them, adapting operations in real time to avoid detection and arrest. The compromise of intelligence services meant that government forces were often fighting blind, while cartels knew their every move. Political corruption extended from local mayors to governors to federal legislators and executive branch officials. Politicians received campaign financing from cartel sources, often through elaborate laundering schemes that made contributions appear legitimate. The implicit or explicit understanding was that elected officials would protect cartel interests by blocking anti-trafficking legislation, preventing aggressive enforcement, and providing advance warning of operations that couldn't be blocked. The judicial system's corruption ensured that traffickers who were arrested often escaped serious consequences. Prosecutors and judges received payments to lose evidence, make procedural errors that invalidated cases, or simply rule favorably in cartel-related proceedings. The corruption meant that arrests rarely translated to significant prison time, creating a revolving door where traffickers were quickly returned to operations. Prison corruption transformed correctional facilities into comfortable bases from which cartel leaders continued operations. Guards and administrators received payments to provide prohibited items, allow unrestricted communications, and allow conjugal visits and meetings. The most comprehensive corruption turned prisons into luxury accommodations, where imprisoned traffickers lived better than many free citizens, conducting business without meaningful restriction.
Banking and financial sector corruption facilitated money laundering essential to trafficking operations. Bank officials accepted obviously suspicious deposits, created accounts under false identities, and structured transactions to avoid reporting requirements. Major international financial institutions were implicated in laundering billions from Mexican cartels, paying fines that were modest compared to profits earned from facilitating illicit transactions. Business sector corruption extended beyond money laundering to active participation in trafficking logistics. Transportation companies moved drugs hidden in legitimate cargo. Real estate developers built properties used for trafficking operations. Retail businesses served as fronts for money laundering. Many business owners weren't willing participants but were extorted into cooperation, while others actively sought cartel relationships as profitable opportunities. Professional services, lawyers, accountants, notaries provided essential technical expertise for sophisticated trafficking operations. Attorneys structured business entities to conceal ownership, negotiated with government officials on clients' behalf, and sometimes served as de facto cartel members despite professional obligations. Accountants managed complex financial operations spanning multiple countries and jurisdictions. Notaries authenticated fraudulent documents that supported trafficking infrastructure. Media corruption shaped public understanding of drug trafficking and violence. Some journalists were directly paid to publish favorable coverage or suppress unfavorable stories. Others practiced self-censorship after witnessing violence against reporters. The result was information environments where cartel activities were systematically underreported or mischaracterized, allowing operations to continue without public pressure for effective enforcement. Religious institution corruption was more subtle but real. Churches and religious leaders received donations from traffickers, creating financial dependencies that influenced moral positions on drug trafficking. Some religious figures openly blessed cartel members and operations, providing spiritual legitimization that helped traffickers rationalize their activities. The compromised religious authority couldn't provide moral leadership against the trafficking economy. Educational institution corruption affected universities and schools in trafficking regions. Some institutions accepted donations from traffickers, influencing curriculum and research agendas. Cartel members attended universities alongside students pursuing legitimate careers, sometimes earning degrees they would use in trafficking operations. The presence of narco money in education compromised institutions that should have opposed the trafficking economy.
Social institution corruption extended to NGOs, community organizations, and civil society groups. Some organizations depended on donations from traffickers, limiting their ability to advocate against trafficking or violence. Community leaders maintained relationships with cartels as necessary for accessing resources and protection in areas where government failed to provide basic services. The mechanics of corruption involved sophisticated approaches beyond simple bribery. Cartels cultivated relationships over years, identifying promising junior officials and supporting their career advancement through financial assistance, political backing, or solving personal problems. The invested relationships created loyal allies who felt personal obligations beyond simple financial transactions. The silver or lead approach, accept bribes or face bullets, created additional pressure beyond positive incentives. Officials who rejected corruption faced threats to themselves and families, making resistance require not just integrity but extraordinary courage. Many officials rationalized cooperation as necessary for survival, concluding that they couldn't change the system and might as well benefit from it. The systemic nature of corruption meant that honest officials were isolated and neutralized. An honest police chief found that subordinates reported to cartels. An honest prosecutor discovered that evidence disappeared or witnesses recanted. An honest judge's verdicts were overturned on appeal by corrupted superior courts. The institutional rot was so complete that individual integrity couldn't overcome structural compromise.
The economic scale of corruption was staggering, with estimates suggesting billions of dollars in annual bribery payments. These payments represented rational business investments for cartels, buying protection and operational freedom that generated far more value than the bribes cost. From the cartel's perspective, corruption was the most cost-effective security expense, more valuable than armed security forces. The social acceptance of corruption created cultural normalization. In regions where everyone knew certain officials were corrupted, the situation became almost accepted reality rather than scandalous revelation. Residents learned to navigate dual systems, official procedures and unofficial fixes, with corruption as expected part of any governmental interaction. The anti-corruption efforts that occurred periodically faced overwhelming challenges. Investigators found that witnesses feared testifying, evidence disappeared, and colleagues undermined cases. High-profile arrests occasionally occurred, but rarely resulted in convictions or significant operational impacts. The corruption was so deeply embedded that surgical removal of compromised officials was impossible. The entire system required transformation. The international dimensions of corruption extended beyond Mexico. American officials, while less systematically compromised, weren't immune. Border agents, local police, and even federal officials were occasionally arrested for accepting cartel bribes. The corruption revealed that the drug trade's influence extended throughout the supply chain, from production to final consumption.
Rise of the narco-soldiers, a new breed of killers. The evolution of cartel enforcement from street criminals with guns to militarized units with special forces training represented a fundamental transformation in Mexican drug trafficking. The emergence of Los Zetas, formed by Mexican Army Special Forces deserters, created a new paradigm that forced all cartels, including Sinaloa, to professionalize their armed wings to remain competitive. This militarization elevated violence to new levels and created security challenges that law enforcement struggled to address. The origins of Los Zetas trace to the late 1990s when the Gulf Cartel recruited Lieutenant Arturo Guzman de Sena and approximately 30 other members of the Mexican Army Special Forces Air Mobile Group, GAFE, to serve as armed protection and enforcement. These soldiers brought professional military training, discipline, and tactical expertise that was unprecedented in drug trafficking. Their code name, Zeta, eventually became the group's identity. The desertion of Special Forces soldiers to work for cartels resulted from several factors. Military salaries were modest, particularly compared to what cartels could pay. Soldiers witnessed narco wealth daily and recognized that their military skills were valuable to trafficking organizations. Some became corrupted while still in service, eventually deciding to leave officially and work for cartels full-time. The military training intended to combat cartels became the foundation for more effective trafficking operations. Lozetta's military background transformed cartel enforcement. They introduced disciplined operational planning, reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, and tactical execution of operations. Their assaults on rivals were coordinated maneuvers with fire teams, support elements, and contingency planning, not disorganized shootouts. The professionalism made them extraordinarily effective and extremely dangerous. The success of Lozetta's forced competing cartels to develop similar capabilities or face annihilation. The Sinaloa cartel responded by professionalizing its armed wings, recruiting from military and police backgrounds, establishing training programs that mimicked military instruction, and adopting organizational structures with ranks, specializations, and chain of command. The informal gangster model couldn't compete against military-trained opposition. Training camps established throughout Mexico provided instruction in weapons handling, tactical movement, close-quarters combat, reconnaissance, communications, and survival skills. Some camps reportedly brought in foreign instructors, including veterans of Colombian conflicts and even some with experience in international military forces. The training was serious, intensive, and designed to create effective fighting forces. The weaponry available to these narco soldiers rivaled and sometimes exceeded what legitimate Mexican security forces possessed. Heavy machine guns, grenade launchers, rocket-propelled grenades, anti-aircraft weapons, and high-end rifles appeared in cartel arsenals. Some weapons were acquired from military sources through corruption, others from Central American countries with loose controls, and many from the United States through straw purchase operations and gun shows. The formation of specialized units within the Sinaloa cartel created elite groups responsible for high-value operations. Units like Los Antrax emerged as particularly capable, handling protection of leadership figures, high-profile killings, and operations requiring sophistication beyond street-level enforcers. These units developed reputations, with members achieving cult status in narco culture and corridos celebrating their exploits. The recruitment process for narco soldier positions was selective, seeking individuals with the right combinations of physical capability, psychological disposition, and loyalty. Some recruits came from military or police backgrounds, bringing professional training. Others were recruited young and trained entirely within the cartel system. The most promising received advanced instruction and opportunities for advancement within enforcement hierarchies. The organizational structure of cartel armed wings mirrored military formations, with commanders, units, specializations, and clear chains of command. Radio call signs, tactical communication protocols, and operational procedures followed military models.
This organizational sophistication allowed coordination of complex operations involving multiple units operating in different locations toward unified objectives. The intelligence capabilities of narco soldiers extended beyond simple reconnaissance to sophisticated collection and analysis. Cartels employed scouts who monitored government forces, informants within law enforcement and military units who provided advance warning of operations, and technical specialists who conducted electronic surveillance. The intelligence operations allowed cartels to operate with superior information compared to government forces. The psychological profile of narco soldiers varied considerably. Some were true believers in cartel mythology, viewing themselves as soldiers fighting for their organization and region. Others were purely mercenary, motivated by financial compensation. Many consumed drugs, particularly methamphetamine, to maintain aggression and overcome inhibitions against violence. The combination created individuals capable of extreme brutality. The social media presence of some narco-soldier units represented new frontiers in criminal propaganda. Members posted photos with weapons, luxury items, and captured enemies. Some accounts glorified the narco-soldier lifestyle, attracting young recruits who saw images of power and wealth. The digital presence served recruitment, intimidation, and reputation management functions. The confrontations between narco-soldiers and Mexican security forces sometimes resembled conventional military engagements rather than law enforcement operations. Sustained firefights with heavy weapons, tactical maneuvers, and coordinated attacks created situations that police were unprepared to handle. Some confrontations required military intervention with armored vehicles and heavy weapons to overcome cartel forces. The defensive positions established by cartels in key territories featured military-style fortifications. Observation posts, communication networks, pre-positioned weapons caches, and fallback positions created defensive networks that complicated government operations. Approaching targets required overcoming multiple defensive layers, giving defenders time to reinforce or evacuate. The counterinsurgency challenge posed by narco-soldiers confused Mexican and American security thinking. These weren't traditional criminals or even insurgents with political objectives, but they employed insurgent tactics, ambushes, improvised explosive devices, propaganda, intelligence networks, and territorial control. The hybrid nature made effective responses difficult to formulate, with law enforcement too limited and full military responses potentially disproportionate. The desertions from security forces to cartels continued despite efforts to improve military and police conditions. The fundamental reality remained that cartels could pay far more than government employers. For soldiers from poor backgrounds, the financial temptation was enormous. Some soldiers planned from enlistment to gain training at government expense before deserting to work for traffickers. The human rights concerns surrounding militarized cartels extended beyond their violence to include forced recruitment of minors. Some organizations kidnapped young men from rural areas, providing training and forcing them into cartel service. Others recruited children who grew up in trafficking communities, indoctrinating them from youth into cartel culture. These child soldiers faced particular risks and created special challenges when captured by authorities. The long-term impacts of cartel militarization extended beyond immediate violence. Veterans of cartel armed wings returned to civilian life with military training but limited legitimate opportunities. Former narco soldiers attempted to integrate into communities, bringing combat trauma, potential violence, and continued connections to trafficking world. The social impact of thousands of militarily trained individuals with cartel backgrounds posed ongoing challenges.
The daylight ambushes. Terror in the streets. The shift from covert drug trafficking to open violence in Mexican streets marked a turning point where cartels no longer operated in shadows but openly challenged government authority through public attacks. These daylight ambushes, confrontations, and massacres demonstrated that traffickers felt sufficiently powerful to operate without pretense of concealment, transforming public spaces into battlegrounds where civilians became unwilling witnesses to warfare. The symbolic significance of daylight violence was profound. Operating under cover of darkness suggested fear of authorities and recognition of illegal status. Conducting operations openly suggested that cartels felt no such constraints, that they controlled territory so completely that government response was irrelevant or that corrupted authorities would look the other way regardless of how blatant the activities. The attacks on government buildings in broad daylight particularly demonstrated cartel confidence. Police headquarters, military installations, and government offices were hit with gunfire, grenades, and sometimes sustained assaults intended not just to kill specific individuals, but to demonstrate power. The attacks communicated that nowhere was truly secure, that official buildings provided no sanctuary from cartel violence. The ambushes of military and police convoys on public highways created spectacles of power projection. Cartel forces, sometimes numbering dozens of gunmen with military weapons and vehicles, attacked security forces in broad daylight, often successfully overwhelming the targeted units. The ambushes were sometimes recorded and distributed via social media, maximizing their propaganda value as demonstrations of cartel military capability. The targeting of rival cartel members in public locations, restaurants, shopping centers, busy streets, showed complete disregard for civilian safety. Shootouts in crowded areas killed and wounded bystanders whose only mistake was being present when cartel conflicts erupted. The indifference to collateral damage marked a degradation from earlier periods when traffickers attempted to limit violence to those involved in the drug trade. The narco-blockades that paralyzed cities represented peak expressions of daylight power projection. In response to arrests or other government actions, cartels orchestrated simultaneous attacks throughout urban areas, burning vehicles, blocking major roads, attacking government buildings and businesses, creating chaos that overwhelmed authorities and demonstrated that cartels could seize control of cities when they chose. One particularly notable narco-blockade occurred in Culiacan in October 2019 when security forces arrested Ovidio Guzman Lopez, El Chapo's son. Sinaloa cartel forces responded with coordinated attacks throughout the city, overwhelming police and military forces and creating situations where soldiers were surrounded and at risk of being overrun. The Mexican government, in a decision that remains controversial, ordered Ovidio's release to prevent further violence and casualties, a capitulation that demonstrated cartel power over government authority. The psychological impact on civilian populations witnessing daylight violence was profound and lasting. Residents of affected cities developed acute anxiety about moving through public spaces, never knowing when violence might erupt. Parents feared sending children to school. Businesses suffered as customers avoided areas known for violence. The psychological terrorism was as damaging as the physical violence itself. The evolution to social media documentation created new dimensions of terror. Violence was increasingly recorded by participants or witnesses and shared virally through WhatsApp, Facebook, and other platforms. The video spread fear far beyond those who witnessed events directly, creating viral terror that reached millions. The digital amplification multiplied the psychological impact of each violent incident. The targeting of specific businesses and industries demonstrated cartels' interest in controlling legal economy beyond drug trafficking. Gas stations, avocado growers, lime producers, mining operations, and numerous other legitimate businesses faced extortion demands backed by threats of violence. Resistance resulted in daylight attacks on business owners, their facilities, and employees, forcing compliance through terror.
The phenomenon of cartel checkpoints on public roads blurred lines between criminal organization and pseudo-governmental authority. Gunmen stopped vehicles, demanded identification, interrogated occupants, and sometimes detained or killed those they deemed suspicious. The checkpoints demonstrated territorial control, operating in areas where official government presence was absent or neutralized through corruption. The response capabilities of Mexican security forces proved inadequate to confront daylight violence effectively. Police were often outgunned and outnumbered, retreating rather than engaging when facing large cartel forces. Military responses, when they occurred, sometimes escalated situations, creating larger confrontations that endangered more civilians. The inadequacy of official responses reinforced perceptions of government weakness. The media coverage of daylight violence faced constraints from both danger to journalists and government pressure. Reporters risking their lives to document violence provided crucial information to citizens trying to navigate dangerous environments. However, some coverage was criticized for sensationalizing violence or inadvertently serving as cartel propaganda by amplifying terror. The balance between informing public and amplifying fear was difficult. The international visibility of daylight violence damaged Mexico's reputation and tourism industry. Foreign visitors witnessed or learned about public violence, affecting decisions about travel to Mexico. The economic impact extended beyond tourism to foreign investment, as businesses considered security situations when making location decisions. The violence created economic costs far beyond immediate victims. The desensitization that occurred in heavily affected communities represented another psychological consequence. Residents became accustomed to violence that would shock people from peaceful areas. Children grew up accepting violence as normal part of life. The normalization of extreme brutality raised concerns about long-term social impacts and how communities might recover when violence eventually decreased. The failure of government strategies to effectively combat daylight violence suggested that military approaches were insufficient without addressing underlying conditions. Poverty, corruption, weak institutions, and limited economic opportunities created environments where cartels could recruit, operate, and maintain popular support despite their violence. Military operations that didn't address these structural issues achieved temporary tactical successes without strategic victory.
The golden era of Sinaloa, when money ruled everything. At the height of its power in the 2000s and early 2010s, the Sinaloa cartel achieved dominance over Mexican drug trafficking that was unprecedented in scope, generating revenues that rivaled legitimate corporations and wielding influence that challenged government authority. This golden era, when El Chapo was at the zenith of his power and the organization operated across continents, represented the peak of what a criminal enterprise could achieve through strategic vision, operational excellence, and systematic corruption. The financial scope of Sinaloa operations during this period was almost incomprehensible. Estimates suggested the cartel moved hundreds of tons of cocaine annually, along with substantial quantities of heroin, methamphetamine, and marijuana. The total revenue generated was estimated in tens of billions of dollars annually, making the Sinaloa cartel one of the most profitable criminal organizations in human history. The cocaine business provided the primary revenue source, with the cartel serving as principal transporter for Colombian cocaine destined for U.S. markets. The Sinaloan role in the supply chain commanded substantial premiums. Purchasing cocaine in Colombia for a few $1,000s per kilogram, then selling in American cities for 10 or 20 times that amount. The markup represented profit margins that legitimate businesses could never achieve. The relationship with Colombian suppliers was sophisticated and mutually beneficial. Sinaloan traffickers paid reliably, moved product efficiently, and maintained operational security that minimized seizures. This reliability earned them preferred partner status, receiving better prices, larger shipments, and even credit arrangements that allowed them to receive cocaine before payment, a massive financial advantage that provided working capital without borrowing. The American distribution network extended to virtually every major U.S. city, with the cartel supplying wholesalers who distributed through established retail networks. The organization rarely touched street-level sales, instead operating at wholesale level, where transactions involved multi-kilogram quantities worth hundreds of thousands or millions. This positioning reduced visibility while capturing most profitable portions of the supply chain. The heroin business operated somewhat differently, with the Sinaloa cartel controlling the complete supply chain, from poppy cultivation in the Sierra Madre through processing into heroin to distribution in American markets. This vertical integration meant profits at every stage and eliminated dependence on external suppliers who might prove unreliable or expensive. The methamphetamine business exploded during this era, transforming from relatively minor product to major revenue source. The Sinaloa cartel recognized methamphetamine's advantages: inexpensive production from chemical precursors, high profit margins, strong demand, and ease of transportation compared to bulkier marijuana. They invested in sophisticated laboratories producing high-quality product, particularly ice methamphetamine that commanded premium prices. The marijuana business faced changing dynamics as American states began legalizing and local production increased. The Sinaloan response was strategic repositioning, reducing investment in marijuana relative to more profitable products, while maintaining operations that served markets where marijuana remained illegal. The flexibility demonstrated business acumen rather than rigid commitment to specific product lines. The money laundering operations required to convert drug profits into usable assets became increasingly sophisticated. The cartel employed multiple methods simultaneously: bulk cash smuggling back to Mexico, wire transfers through front companies, trade-based laundering using over and under invoicing, real estate purchases, legitimate business investments, and increasingly cryptocurrency transactions. The diversification ensured that no single enforcement action could cripple financial operations. The investment of drug profits into legitimate Mexican economy created the narco-economy phenomenon, where legal and illegal financing became inextricably mixed. Real estate development, restaurants, car dealerships, construction companies, agricultural operations, and numerous other businesses received narco investment.
This injection of illicit capital distorted markets, allowing narco-funded businesses to operate at losses that would bankrupt legitimate competitors. The lifestyle enjoyed by upper-level cartel members during the golden era was ostentatious beyond measure. Luxury vehicles, designer clothes, expensive jewelry, private parties with famous musicians, and lavish celebrations marked narco culture. The displays of wealth served multiple purposes: demonstrating success, rewarding loyalty, recruiting ambitious newcomers, and establishing social status within communities where narco figures were celebrities. The political influence wielded by the Sinaloa cartel at its peak penetrated highest levels of Mexican government. The organization maintained relationships with officials at federal, state, and municipal levels, providing campaign financing, buying votes, and corrupting administrative processes. Some analysts argue that the cartel effectively controlled certain state governments, with elected officials essentially serving as political arms of trafficking organizations. The social power exercised in Sinaloan communities manifested through charity work that government failed to provide. The cartel built infrastructure, roads, schools, medical clinics, provided employment, sponsored community celebrations, and offered rough justice against common criminals. This social investment created genuine popular support that went beyond fear, with many residents viewing cartels more favorably than government. The cultural impact of narco wealth created aspirational narratives, particularly among young men with limited legitimate opportunities. The narco lifestyle, money, power, beautiful women, respect, represented success in communities where alternatives meant poverty and obscurity. Corridos celebrated trafficking as adventure and business rather than crime, creating cultural narratives that normalized and glamorized the trade. The international expansion of Sinaloa operations during this era was impressive. Beyond traditional U.S. markets, the cartel established distribution in Europe, where cocaine prices were substantially higher. They developed relationships with European criminal organizations, particularly Italian mafias, Albanian networks, and British gangs. The transcontinental operations required logistics, communications, and trust building that demonstrated sophisticated international business capabilities. The expansion to Asian and Australian markets represented newer frontiers with extraordinary profit potential. Methamphetamine particularly found strong demand in these markets, with Australian prices reaching levels that made long-distance smuggling economically viable despite risks. The diversification across continents meant that enforcement actions in any single market couldn't cripple overall operations. The operational security during this period was sophisticated, with the cartel employing encrypted communications, counterintelligence to detect informants, sophisticated logistics that compartmentalized operations, and quick adaptation when law enforcement demonstrated new capabilities. The security measures demonstrated learning from past arrests and seizures, constantly evolving to stay ahead of enforcement.
The corruption networks maintained during this era represented enormous ongoing investments. Estimates suggested hundreds of millions in annual bribery payments to Mexican officials at all levels. While expensive, the corruption purchased protection that was more valuable than the cost, allowing operations to continue relatively unimpeded despite official anti-drug efforts. The Golden Era wasn't without challenges. Arrests of high-level figures, major seizures, territorial conflicts with rivals, and periodic government crackdowns created ongoing obstacles. However, the organization's depth meant that no single enforcement action proved catastrophic. The loss of one leader meant elevation of deputies, seized shipments were replaced, arrested members stayed silent or were replaced, and operations continued. The beginning of the end of the Golden Era can be traced to several developments. El Chapo's 2014 capture and eventual extradition to the United States removed the organization's most visible and arguably most capable leader. The fragmentation of territories as internal conflicts split the organization.
The rise of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel as a serious rival that seized territory and challenged Sinaloan dominance. And evolving law enforcement capabilities that made some traditional operations more difficult. The Great Hunt versus the Ghost King. The pursuit of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman became an obsession for Mexican and American authorities. A manhunt spanning decades that repeatedly captured and lost one of the world's most wanted fugitives. The chase revealed the challenges of confronting sophisticated criminal organizations operating in environments where corruption was pervasive, support from local populations was strong, and geographic factors favored fugitives over pursuers. The manhunt began seriously after El Chapo's first arrest in Guatemala in 1993. Though even during his imprisonment, he remained a target for those seeking to prevent his continued operations from Puente Grande prison. His 2001 escape transformed the pursuit into an international priority, with Mexican authorities facing enormous pressure and embarrassment over allowing such a high-profile prisoner to simply walk away. The challenge of locating El Chapo in the Sierra Madre Mountains was formidable. The terrain favored fugitives with its rugged topography, limited road access, and population sympathetic to traffickers. Guzman reportedly moved between safe houses and remote ranches, with elaborate security networks providing advance warning of any government approach. Some reports suggested he maintained dozens of properties, never staying in one location long enough for authorities to effectively target. The intelligence gathering required to locate El Chapo involved Mexican and American agencies including the DEA, FBI, CIA, NSA, and Mexican military intelligence. The cooperation between agencies was often complicated by mutual distrust. American officials worried that Mexican counterparts were compromised, while Mexican authorities resented American involvement in their sovereignty. Despite tensions, information sharing was essential since neither country's agencies alone possessed all necessary capabilities. The electronic surveillance that eventually proved crucial to locating El Chapo required sophisticated technical capabilities. Intercepting communications from cartel members, analyzing patterns, and triangulating locations from cellular signals provided intelligence that traditional methods couldn't generate. However, the cartel's awareness of electronic surveillance meant continuous adaptation, switching phones frequently, using encrypted applications, and employing couriers for sensitive communications. The series of near misses and failed operations frustrated authorities and demonstrated El Chapo's security capabilities. On multiple occasions, government forces raided locations where he had been shortly before, finding warm food and other evidence of his recent presence, but not the man himself. The advance warnings he received suggested compromised operations, with information about planned raids reaching him in time to escape. The February 2014 operation that finally captured El Chapo in Mazatlan represented the culmination of months of intelligence work tracking his communications network.
The operation focused on identifying his courier network and communications infrastructure rather than searching for his physical location directly. By tracking messages and movements of associates, authorities narrowed his location to specific areas, eventually identifying the condo tower where he was staying. The arrest itself was almost anticlimactic. El Chapo was taken without the dramatic shootout that some expected, captured in early morning raid before he could escape through a prepared tunnel beneath the building. The absence of massive security and the relatively easy capture raised questions about whether he had grown complacent or whether the sophistication of intelligence operations made escape impossible once his location was identified. His imprisonment in Altiplano maximum security prison was supposed to prevent any possibility of escape, with authorities having learned from the embarrassment of his 2001 escape. The security measures included 24-hour surveillance, restricted visitation, and protocols designed specifically to prevent the corruption that facilitated his previous escape. Despite these measures, the planning for his next escape began almost immediately. The July 2015 escape through a sophisticated tunnel directly to his cell was an engineering marvel and security catastrophe.
The digging occurred over months, presumably with noise that should have been detected had anyone been listening. The escape revealed that security measures meant nothing when corruption allowed inside assistance. The manhunt that followed the 2015 escape was the most intense and highest priority, with Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto facing humiliation internationally and domestically. The escape made Mexico look incapable of holding its most notorious criminal, prompting unprecedented commitment of resources to recapture. American pressure intensified, with clear messages that Mexico's credibility was on the line. The operations during this manhunt became more aggressive, with Mexican Marines conducting raids throughout Sinaloa based on intelligence that was sometimes solid and other times merely hopeful. The operations killed and captured various cartel members, but initially failed to locate El Chapo himself, who once again demonstrated ability to evade massive efforts to find him. The January 2016 recapture in Los Mochis, Sinaloa, occurred after El Chapo's desire to have his story filmed led him to meet with actor Sean Penn and Mexican actress Kate Del Castillo. The meeting provided intelligence leads that helped authorities track his location. The resulting operation involved intense firefight with El Chapo's security forces, allowing him to initially escape through tunnels before being apprehended hours later. The decision to extradite El Chapo to the United States, finalized in January 2017, represented acknowledgement that Mexico couldn't reliably hold him. American officials had sought extradition for years, arguing that only U.S. maximum security prisons could prevent another escape. Mexican officials had resisted, viewing extradition as admission of failure, but after 2 escapes, the argument against extradition became impossible to sustain. The extradition marked the end of El Chapo's time in Mexico and the beginning of his prosecution in the United States. His arrival in New York to face charges there symbolized the ultimate triumph of American law enforcement's decades-long pursuit. For Mexican authorities, it represented both relief, he was no longer their problem, and embarrassment that they couldn't solve the problem domestically. The broader manhunt extended beyond just El Chapo to include other Sinaloa cartel leaders, with varying degrees of success. Ismael El Mayo Zambada remained at large, despite being among America's most wanted fugitives, demonstrating that El Chapo's capture didn't mean the end of the organization or even the capture of all leadership. Mayo's continued freedom suggested that the factors that protected El Chapo for so long, corruption, popular support, geographic advantages, continued protecting other cartel figures. The strategy debates during the manhunt involved fundamental questions about whether targeting leadership was effective. Some argued that arresting top leaders created power vacuums that sparked violence as subordinates fought for succession.
Others contended that organizations required leadership and that removing capable leaders degraded organizational effectiveness. The evidence was mixed, with some leadership arrests causing fragmentation while others resulted in peaceful transitions. The international cooperation that characterized the manhunt extended beyond Mexican and American agencies to include intelligence from various countries where Sinaloa operations existed. The transnational nature of modern drug trafficking meant that effective pursuit required international networks matching the criminal networks being targeted. The technological dimensions of the hunt evolved continuously, with each side adapting to the other's capabilities. Government surveillance technologies improved, but cartel countermeasures evolved correspondingly. Encrypted communications, disposable phones, couriers rather than electronic messages, and other security measures sought to limit the intelligence that authorities could gather. The human intelligence that ultimately proved crucial to major arrests often came from the criminal organizations themselves. Informants, motivated by deals for reduced sentences, rivalries between cartel factions, or personal grudges, provided information that technical surveillance alone couldn't generate.
However, developing reliable informants within tight-knit organizations where betrayal meant death for informants and families was extremely difficult.